Hello everyone and welcome back to the Muddy Mint Studio. Today we're going to do something fun. We're going to master batch some oils. And it's not really master batching. I'll put the word master in quotes because it's actually, we're not making a huge master batch. We're going to be prepping buckets. So we have 6 of these buckets here that we're going to set up with our recipe. So I am setting up for soap making tomorrow, and I thought I would have you guys follow along on my setup journey. What I normally do is I make 6 buckets at a time of the exact same recipe. We have quite a few recipes at Muddy Mint, so this is just one of our recipes. It's our cocoa butter recipe. We use this recipe in our wild lavender soap, in our winter pine soap, rosemary mint juniper. You can get all of those recipes online if you're interested at muddymint.com. And so this is going to be a setup video for making our buckets and getting them prepped for soap making tomorrow. And I do this for 2 reasons. First of all, prepping everything and making soap in the same day is kind of a long day for me. So I like to prep everything in advance, and then when it's time to make soap, everything is ready to go. So what I do is I prep my 50-50 lye-water solution if I don't have any left, which I don't have any left, so I'll be doing that as well. And also I'm going to be prepping my buckets, and I'm going to make all my buckets the same. So tomorrow I'm going to make all the soaps that use the same recipe. Now you might have the same recipe for every single one of your soaps, in which case you can prep as many buckets as you want, which is super nice. When you master batch your oils, it's a different process. Master batching typically means that you have either a big drum or a big container, an oil tank, where you put your entire recipe in there. And then when it's time to make your soap, you simply draw from that master batch. So this is maybe what I would call small batch oil prep. Basically, I'm going to be using these buckets. And like I said, I have 6 of them, and one of these buckets makes 10 pounds of soap. So we use these Nurture soap molds. I'm going to go grab one. So these are our Nurture soap molds. They're 5 pounds each. So one of these buckets will make 2 of these, which is super handy. I have these buckets linked down below in the description if you're interested in getting them, but they're basically 6-quart or 6-liter buckets. So this is really a great size. They do end up pretty high in the end. Once you add the lye and all the extra ingredients, the oils and everything go up pretty close to the top, but it's always worked really great for me personally. All right, one way that I've done this in the past is just to prepare 2 buckets at a time. If you're a smaller batch soap maker and you don't need 6 buckets, one nice thing to do is to have 2 of these scales. I have 2 scales because I like being able to do something and then have somebody else do something else elsewhere measuring. But what you could do is set up like this and then prep your oils in 2 buckets like this. And then you have 2 scales going at once, so it's super efficient. But what I do is I set up a little rainbow, or I like to call it my rainbow. And I always start from left to right. So before I turned on the camera, I set up a few things. One thing I did is I chopped up some of my cocoa butter, and basically I use a big knife to chop up the cocoa butter into smaller pieces. And this is a little bit cumbersome when you buy cocoa butter in a big block like this, but you can also get it in pastilles, cocoa butter pastilles, and they're basically, or wafers, I guess is what you call them. So you can get these cocoa butter wafers, and that makes it way easier to dispense your cocoa butter. And I used to do that, but right now I have this big block, so that's why I use this basically giant kitchen knife. This is my butcher knife that I use to chop all the cocoa butter up. The other thing that I did is I pulled some coconut oil from the drum. So we have a drum right now of coconut oil, and it has a heat band on it at the bottom to keep everything liquid inside. And the drum is super handy to use. We have the pump that is a Blackmer pump that I can also link down below if you're interested. And that makes pumping out the coconut oil super easy. Now this drum is left over from when we had coconut oil at the larger studio. So once this drum is gone, we're going to start buying our coconut oil in smaller batches. But for now, it's great. We have this drum of coconut oil. And finally, I also filled up my avocado and castor oil. We put our avocado and castor oil in these containers with a red lid that I got from Webstaurant. And these are super handy for putting your Cubitainer into. And so instead of using the spout on the Cubitainer, we basically just use this, we open up the top and pour directly into our containers, which is a little bit tough to do, granted, when you first open a Cubitainer because they're quite heavy. But in that case, I just put my container on the ground and fill it from there. So those are just the ways that I do things. You don't have to do it exactly like this. This is just what works for me. And so I thought I would share my process with you. All right. So the other thing I have here is my recipe. I have it off here to the side. And what I always do is start with my hard oils. And like I said, I start with the bucket on the left, and I'm going to work my way around. So I like to do the same ingredient in every single bucket first so that I always have the same number in mind and I don't get myself confused. You can also do one bucket at a time if you find that easier. So I'm going to tare my scale, and it's at 0 now, and I'm going to put my cocoa butter in here. And like I said, I'm going to go around and do all the buckets, and anyway, you can see exactly how I do it. We use quite a lot of cocoa butter in this recipe. It's a very cocoa butter dense recipe, so that's why there's so much going in here. And I just keep my cocoa butter here on a stool right next to me, so it's really easy to access. And it's really nice to chop this up ahead of time so that you're not doing it while you're trying to make your buckets, although I probably will have to do a little bit of chopping. And I'm going to have to get rid of some of this so that it comes out to the right amount. Okay, so that's the first bucket. And then I go on to the next one. And basically I know where I'm at because there's always a space and I'm always going left to right and I never deviate from that. Now, you would think that these containers all weigh the same, but they don't, so make sure to tare in between. Okay, you'll notice that I'm not wearing gloves, and that's on purpose. I did wash my hands before doing anything. The gloves I find just get in the way of me being able to do this efficiently, especially because I have small hands and they just get really oily. And so what I do is I keep a rag here just to wipe my hands down with if needed. And also I like to get some of that cocoa butter on my skin. So what I'm going to do is go through and do the cocoa butter for each of these. You don't need to watch me do this one at a time. Hopefully you get the idea. Tare before each bucket, and I'm going to go through and do all 6, and I'll meet you back for the next ingredient. Okay, so we are done with the cocoa butter. One of the reasons that I start with the cocoa butter is because it's a hard oil, so it's hard to get the exact measurement out because you're not pouring, So this way I can pull out any cocoa butter that's extra so I get my measurements exact. Now, if we were adding shea butter to this, I would do that next, or any kind of solid butter or oil. For example, if the coconut oil was solid, ours is liquid, but if it was solid, then I would put it in next so that I can pull some out as well easily if need be. So I'm just going to tidy up my area here, and then we're going to go on to the coconut oil. All right, so I have my coconut oil here, and it is liquid, as I mentioned earlier. We pumped it out of a drum. And so what I'm going to do is just put the amount in here for each bucket. Again, I'm starting on the left so I don't get myself confused. And this won't be enough for all the buckets, so I'll have to go back and pump more in a minute. All right, that's the first one. Again, I'm going to go around my rainbow and do one at a time. Now, at this point, it's really easy to see which buckets you've done and which ones you haven't because of the way they look. But eventually, it's going to get a little bit trickier to figure out. So that's why the rainbow is important. By the way, these containers are great. I got them off of Webstaurant, and we put them under each of our drum spouts to basically grab the oil. There's a lot of other ways that you can use drums, and we're going to do a whole video on how to get set up with drums and what you need to know if you've never used drums before. So that's going to be a good one. So stay tuned for that. But having one of these is really handy for all kinds of reasons. Now, it doesn't have a lid, so it is an open top. And you'll see that for our avocado and castor, we have a different kind of container that has a lid on it. But for our drums, this is great. So I'm going to go grab more and I'll be back. So in the last video that we did, we talked about some time-saving measures that will save you labor, which then translates to saving you in cost per bar, or how much it costs you to make a bar. And this is one of those things. Having liquid oil is much quicker to pour than to have to scoop out solid oils. So if you want to invest in drums is one way to do it, or you can just get a heat band and put it around your coconut oil container just to liquefy it. And I think you can get some pumps where you pump like this and then it comes out, and you could potentially put it in a container like this and then use that for making your buckets. All right, I put a little too much in, and at this point, I can actually fix that. So let me show you how I do that. All right, so I have this little scoop that I'm going to use just to scoop out a little bit of the oil. And I didn't have too much extra, but since I can fix it, I might as well. And then I just put it back in. So I usually keep a scoop like this handy for this purpose. Now, once you're doing other liquid oils in here, after this, it's going to be impossible to get it out. But for now, if I can fix it, I might as well. All right, tear out the bucket. By the way, the fewer oils that you have in a recipe, the easier it is to make your master batch. And it's kind of one of the reasons to keep your recipes simple, other than cost, which we talked about in the cost. All right, another thing is don't get distracted while you're pouring because you will mess up. That includes listening to music that you're singing along to. So back to my thought, we talked about this in the cost video, the oil cost video, that keeping things simple actually helps you with your oil costs, just having fewer oils and being able to get your oils more easily, but also having fewer oils also helps you make your buckets faster. So there's a cost savings there as well that you might not really think about when you're formulating your recipe. All right, I'm going to put the coconut oil back, and I'm actually also going to put away this cocoa butter and close it up, and then we're going to move on to our next oil. All right, I actually kind of have a funny story about distractions. One time, Troy and I were in the studio, and I was building buckets just like I am now, and we were listening to music, and usually we listen to sort of, Zen-like, calm music that doesn't have any lyrics. But in this particular day, we were listening to a song called 3 is the Magic Number. Well, I don't know if that was the name of the song, but those were the lyrics. 3 is the magic number. And I was pouring essential oils, and I was supposed to be pouring 4 ounces of essential oil. But I started singing along to the song, and I was thinking to myself, and I said this out loud to Troy, I said, oh, isn't that funny? 3 is the magic number, and that's also the amount of essential oil that I need. And I was singing along and doing my 3 ounces, and then when I got to the last bucket, I was like, wait a minute. 3 is not my magic number. It's actually, I'm supposed to be putting 4 in here. And luckily I was able to fix it by just putting an ounce extra in each one, which, by the way, I can show you how to fix that. It's nice to actually have an empty bucket for this purpose. And let me go grab one. So if you have an empty bucket, you can put it on here and tear it out and then see how much of the ingredients you have in here. And it won't be exact because every bucket is slightly different, but it'll be very close. And I've used this method quite a few times to figure out, like, have I put in my castor oil yet? I've kind of forgot. Obviously, it's better to pay attention and to check things off as you go, which I should be doing. I'm going to check off my cocoa butter and my coconut. But if you do get yourself into a pinch where you're not sure what happened, this is a good way to check. Another thing you can check, especially if you don't have another bucket, is just to compare the weight of two different buckets. So this one's 58.35. And then if I check this one, it's 58.7, but that's just the difference in the bucket. And I can go around and kind of see if they're all the same. And then I can figure out which bucket I left the ingredient out of. So those are just some good tips and tricks to know when you're putting together buckets. And if you do get distracted, the best course of action, first of all, is not to get distracted in the first place. Pay attention to what you're doing. Don't listen to music where you're singing along because you need to be reading the scale. But if you do get distracted, there are ways to get back. And what we've actually done in the past sometimes is if I put avocado twice into this bucket, then what I can do is purposely leave it out of the second bucket. And then I can mix these two together and then redistribute them at the end in order to get the right distribution of oils. So we have done that before too. And hopefully you were following along with that. But so far, I haven't had an issue that I wasn't able to fix where we had to scrap our oils. All right, so back to weighing. I've got my avocado oil. And this is the container that I pour the Cubitainer oils into. So we get our avocado oil from Soaper's Choice and we put it in here, and then it's really easy to pour. And we just keep this on our work surface back there. All right, this is the part where I really have to pay attention. And so I'm gonna go around and do all of these. And just another quick tip, which is maybe obvious, but you usually want to err on the higher side of oils rather than on the lower side. If you're going to be wrong, it's better if you have a little bit more oils, like 0.05 ounces extra, which I just did, is going to be okay because that just translates to a little bit more super fat. So it's not that big a deal. All right, I'm going to put avocado on all of these, and then we'll do the castor. All right, so I'm all done the avocado oil, and I just wanted to point out a couple of things that I thought about while I was pouring. Basically, I always leave the number on the scale here so that when I take my bucket off, I don't tear until the next bucket is on. And that's because that way I can see what my last oil was. So for instance, if I had to go fill up this container or fill up my castor oil or go do something or I got distracted, when I come back, I can see the number on here and I'm like, okay, yeah, I just put avocado oil in there because I know what the weight is of that oil. So that's one good tip. The other good tip is to have a good scale. So this is my absolute favorite scale. Like I said, we have two of these in the studio. We've never really needed more than two, although if you have quite a few employees, you probably do want more than two. But this scale is fantastic. And the reason it's so good is because it doesn't turn off. Now, when you get the scale, you do have to set it up to not turn off. It also has a light too, by the way, which I really like. But I forget exactly how you do it, but there's a certain set of actions that allows you to ensure that the scale doesn't turn off. So you do want to make sure your batteries are fresh before you start doing something like this because you don't want the scale to turn off all of a sudden. But when I first started making soap, I didn't know this about scales. And so I just had a regular scale and it automatically turned off after 1 minute. And so I'd be, in the middle of pouring my avocado oil and I would get to, half of what I needed. And I didn't think to look at the number to see what it said. So I'd go fill up my container and then I'd come back and my scale was off and I had no clue where I was at. And that is hugely annoying when you're making soap because you often get distracted and you have to fill up another container or go open a new drum or whatever it is that you're doing, or you just get distracted talking to somebody walks in. Whatever it is, it's nice for your scale not to turn off. So super important to have a scale like that. You can also have your scale plugged in, but I find that super inconvenient because I move my scale all over the place. All right, so we're done with avocado. By the way, I have these labeled and I also organize them alphabetically over there on my work surface. And so I know that the avocado is always on the left, the castor's on the right. So just like a few little tips to not get yourself confused, plus they're labeled. In addition, when I am pouring from the Cubitainer in here, I always double check both containers. I check to make sure this says castor, and I check to make sure that I'm pouring from the castor oil Cubitainer. And I do the same thing with essential oils when we're pouring from our 11-pound containers into our 33-ounce containers that we have back here. I always check both to make sure that it is like and like. Otherwise, you can end up, putting peppermint in the basil container, which is not good. And I've done it before, so that's how I know. All right. Next is castor oil, and this is our last oil. Oh, let me check off the avocado. Make sure I follow my own advice here. Okay, so I'm going to go through and do all of these, and then I'll let you know what we do with these after they're all full. Okay, we are all done. Now, I do always put the castor oil in last because it is quite viscous, and so I like to have other oils in there so that it doesn't just stick to the bottom of the container. So this is our entire recipe, except we're missing one major oil, and that's olive oil. And that's on purpose because what I'm going to do is warm up all of my hard oils first, plus this little bit of, well, obviously there's coconut oil in here, which isn't hard, but tomorrow it'll probably be hard as it sits here overnight. And it has a little bit of avocado and a little bit of castor, just to add a little bit of liquid to our containers. And I warm these up in the microwave. And you may or may not want to use a microwave, and that's totally up to you. You could also scoop these into a stainless steel pot and put it on your stove. However you want to warm up your hard oils is completely up to you. We have a microwave back here that is a really nice size for these buckets. The buckets fit exactly in there. So one thing to take note of is that these buckets are a little bit tall. So make sure that if you are using a microwave, that you have a microwave that can accommodate this height of bucket. And you normally warm them up, depending on how liquid everything is or how big our chunks of cocoa butter are and those kinds of things. We normally put them in the microwave for between 4 and 6 minutes and then stir. So you are going to need to stir afterwards. And what I look for normally is to have the oils at about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And once they're at 140, and I don't wait for that temperature, that's just an approximate temperature. So sometimes I would rather have them be at 140 or more, basically. And then that's when I add my olive oil. And the olive oil is completely liquid and it's at room temperature typically, so that'll cool down your oils. And in our case, olive oil is almost 50% of the oils in our recipe. So it works out really well because we warm up this half and then we basically add another half of olive oil. Then after the olive oil is in, we add in goat milk or aloe vera or some other kind of liquid, which is usually either cold from the fridge or at room temperature. And then we add in our essential oils and all our colorants. And by the time that's all said and done, these are normally at about 95 degrees, or that's the target for us anyway. And so we end up having our oils between probably 85 and 100. If they're over 100, I usually wait a little bit longer to make soap. But anyway, that's how we set up our buckets. And I'm just going to close these all up and wrap it up. So these buckets come with lids like this. And since these are all the same, I'm just going to put the lid on and I'm going to put a little sticky note on top of one of them, just saying what it is. So this is our cocoa butter base. That way you know what they are. And trust me, you do want to do this even if it seems super obvious, because it might turn out that you don't make soap for a month and you come back and you sort of forget what these buckets are for. And I used to use a Sharpie and just write on the lid, but Troy, who does most of our dishwashing, did not like that because it was difficult to get the Sharpie off. But you could use a whiteboard marker, which would probably work great as well. So I stack these up in twos, and I'll show you my special spot where I put them. Okay. This is where I put all of the buckets. So once these buckets are full and ready to make soap with, like I said, we warm these up in the microwave, add our olive oil, and then finish off our recipe from there. So it's super simple to use these once you have the buckets made. And I have a little spot here where the buckets fit exactly under the shelf, which is super handy. And I think I can fit 8 to 10 buckets under there. Again, I've got my little sticky note that says what all these buckets are. In the past, I have had multiple types of buckets. You know, we also have a cocoa and shea butter recipe. And so if that's the case, you definitely want to label each bucket individually rather than just using one sticky note. But as long as you know what each bucket is and also what it's missing, you know, for a long time, I was writing no olive oil on my little sticky note because I was pretty new to making buckets and I didn't want to forget that that's the oil that I want to add in there. So speaking of olive oil, I would also put your olive oil in one of the same types of containers that we used for avocado and castor. We have our olive oil in here. Here's our little label for the olive oil. But basically, this is not big enough for us because we use a lot of olive oil. And we used to pump the olive oil out of our drum, and after that we had custom drums. And so we haven't had to pour olive oil into our buckets for a really, really long time. So I'm definitely gonna go grab one of those containers, maybe with a different color lid so I can differentiate which one's olive oil. Or I would probably put the olive oil on the opposite side so that I know not to get confused. Anyway, if you put the olive oil in here, then it'll be a lot easier to pour and make your buckets with. All right, I think that's it. I hope that helps. Hopefully you learned a little bit of something, and if you didn't, or you have your own technique for how you master batch or small batch your soap making, definitely let me know. That batch of 6 buckets is going to make 5 times, well, basically 60 pounds of soap. So that's pretty good for one day of soap making. And so when I have it done ahead of time, then tomorrow doesn't feel so daunting because I have that part already done. Next, I'm going to make lye, and we'll do a video on that as well. But in case you're curious, we put our lye in these containers, which I can link on in the description box below. We get these from Amazon. We also, actually, a lot of the things that we use today, we get from Amazon, which is unusual for soap making. I usually don't get a lot of stuff from Amazon, but the scale is from Amazon and I love it. These master batch lye containers are from Amazon and they're this heavy duty plastic. We also get our containers from Amazon, although you can also get them at Webstaurant. So Webstaurant and Amazon are great places to find some of these supplies. All right, everybody, have a great day and we'll see you next time.